Excited now. I'm going to hand it off to Michael to tell us about crushes and cruising. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks to the sponsors, and we'll just get started because we have a lot to do. Um, I will put something in the chat. Typically, let me see if it fits in the um okay. So what I put in the chat, you don't have to look at it just yet, but so we're gonna walk through, well, I'm gonna talk a little. And then we're going to walk through kind of the building blocks to a poem, and we're going to write a poem together, and really low pressure kind of really steps to a poem, and really putting the elements together. And by the end of our time together today, we should have a poem that you can sit with and revise and whatever. And but usually this turns out pretty good. Like, people come out of it with uh work that they can turn around and submit to places. So the first, if you look in the chat, I think the link came through. So there's a Kenneth Koch poem called To My 20s, um KOCH, and you can Google it if the link for some reason doesn't work for you. But so that's just for a few minutes from now. So you can get, I don't know if folks, reading speed or whatever. So yeah, thank you so much for having me do this. I think when I this isn't a workshop that I've done before with this theme, and it got me starting to think about what I'll call the two Franks. Um, and I realized that that's very white male or whatever, but well, I think so. The two Franks are Frank Stanford and Frank O'Hara, and obviously, given the local and regional ties, I wanted to feature that. And being in the city now, I think it would be an interesting mashup of sorts. They operated, during a similar time frame, and obviously, I have to say I don't endorse some of the views or whatever that are antiquated and racist. But for our purposes, I think what I realize, given the limited time we have, I think one of the takeaways I would like us to have is kind of what elements or what makes their work sing, or what motifs or whatever make their work still feel fresh, relevant 56, I guess 60 years after the fact, for the most part. And how for remarkable that these poems, obviously written in very different settings, have come to resonate with us still. And one of the things is kind of a grounding to place, or a elements in the poems that speak to uh where the poet or the speaker is writing from, and things of that particular time period, the issues that were relevant to them at the time. And certainly you see this in some of the use of pop culture in O'Hara's work, and the shows that were going on at the time, and the celebrities that were in the news. And with Frank Stanford's work, you see kind of the Southern Gothic, I use that very loosely, vibe or feel of the things that appear in the poems. And so I thought that, so that's one thing. The other thing I think that's interesting is these shifts in perspective within one poem. So, you could have kind of a present sense narration go into like a more like a second person or kind of direct address type feel within the same piece, regardless of the length. And I thought that that was very interesting because it's surprising, I think, and also I think it challenges folks' expectations for uh, what they're going to see in a poem. And I think these sometimes it's very subtle, but even when it's not, I think a lot of the time you come away with that nice kind of jolt or shock that really seemingly uh, brings you back to that particular place and moment in time, as well as kind of takes you out of whatever reality you're living. Um, the other thing is, I think there's a commitment on going back to the motif point. I think there's a commitment to uh, the habitat or the geology or kind of um, plant life, if you will, of their home environments. And you can see that they're very comfortable and conversant in those home kind of districts, and that really comes through the poems, I think, in that it kind of betrays a familiarity with the subjects that they're writing about, as well as kind of nature writ large. We also see, I think, a challenge with meaning, how we use language, and I think uh, one of the members of the New York School, Edwin Denby, said that in poetry, meaning is kind of irrelevant. I'm paraphrasing, but it's kind of like, in a way, it's not what the speaker intends, nor is it what the reader expects. And so it's in this kind of amorphous or kind of twilight zone of where meaning is virtually suspended. And Denby at the time referenced politics and love, to bring things back, as other areas where meaning is kind of amorphous and constantly changing. So having said that, I think we should look at the Kenneth Coke poem. It's kind of short, but we'll do 2 minutes for folks to read. But this will be the first kind of building block of the poem we're going to write together. And so the poem is called To My 20s, and what I'd like us to write or take away from that is you should write a few lines directed to a decade or a time period in your life, future, past, or whatever, um, and and have it as a kind of direct address to your 20s or 30s or whatever, teens. And so we'll do 2 or 3 minutes of that, if that's okay, and then we'll come back and then we'll move forward. And this is all in the chat if for access and whatever else. Okay. Okay. So, and you can keep working, of course. But so I chose this poem because uh it's not a typical Coke poem. Uh and in his collected poems he admits that in the period of 1952 and 1954, he'd written poems that didn't really make it into later books or into his books because they felt so of that time period or out of place with everything else he'd written, and so they never fit quite comfortably in some of the later works, especially some of the longer works. Clearly this is a short work. um and I think he was very preoccupied with um truth, and so it feels very confessional in a way, um very candid, um and was also, I think, a product of his having spent time in France for a year or so, like the other New York School poets who, at different times, you know, lived in France, and in the case of Ashbery, lived extensively in France. Uh, and so the kind of their experience there and working with a language that isn't English, and uh, uh, getting used to meanings uh, and wordplay, and contextualizing the work. I think that's very important. And in the case of Ashbery, you'll see, unlike O'Hara, who uh, famously said that everything that happens to him is goes in the poems or something like that. Um, Ashbery was famously uh, opaque, and that kind of negative capability, or that inability to kind of suss out what exactly he's talking about in any given line, much less any given poem. Uh, and that those dramatic shifts from line to line in Ashbery's work, um, uh, which is a very different approach, I think, than some of the other New York School poets. Um, and I think Wallace Stevens, who, I have to say, like, I don't endorse his views, uh, but he did say that, you know, in terms of writing poetry, how how to live in a world but outside of these existing conceptions of it. Um, and that's one element of Ashbery's work that I really like, wherein, you know, you kind of live in the world, and all of it is happening at the same time, and you're living it all at once, kind of thing. Um, and how we bring that, or how we, um, I guess I don't like the word translate, but how we put that through some process or centrifuge into um, into this kind of complexity of language in a way that makes sense to us, perhaps, maybe not, uh, and maybe perhaps makes sense to the reader. So given the poem's kind of candor, I think I really want, I think step two is for us to write uh, two truths and a lie, and think about how, they can be very simple, short, declarative statements about anything, and think about how we would incorporate that into the poem, uh, now or later, or as we're writing. But let's take a few minutes. Very simple. Uh, and then that's number two. Okay. Um, so there's a line in the Coke poem, or two lines, I guess, where it says, "You never ever were stingy. What you gave me, you gave whole." And that really reminded me of um some of O'Hara's lines, one of which is, you never come when you say you'll come, but at least you do come. Or the line in famously from the Harbor Master poem about tying up and then deciding to depart. Um, and what's interesting about, as we saw in the Paris Review article, these represent kind of uh, uh, shifts in perspective, wherein O'Hara is writing from Larry Rivers' point of view, um, low key, and it's an interesting approach to take, and it represents kind of O'Hara's uh, fun and joyous and kind of extreme rose-colored glasses kind of worldview. Um, and uh, so that's one of the takeaways I wanted to play with, which is kind of um, how these shifts in perspective uh, can come through a piece that we're writing, um, and that kind of um, could perhaps lead to new illumination of, you know, our relationships or our um, friendships with people. And I think uh, in the reading list, I know that there were a lot of poems, but uh, you see there are two poems from Joseph Legaspi uh, relating to garments, and another one relating to a subway ride, which of course is a big city kind of reference. But the way he writes about the subway, and kind of this chance encounter on the subway, is much different from O'Hara's really meandering, extensive, kind of uh, frolic like use of the subway and of cruising spots and of these landmarks in the city. In that Legaspi's treatment is it's a snapshot in time, which is almost the opposite of O'Hara's general approach, which is kind of like, you know, a laundry list of things and just kind of like rambling. Um, and so I wanted to present these different perspectives. I think another thing that both Franz Wright and Frank Stanford do really well is the short poem, kind of these like capsules of in time, or these discrete moments in a very intimate way between a person and whomever they're dealing with. And so I think that approach is uh, equally compelling for different reasons. Um, and so it goes to show how in our recollections of people or in our descriptions of people, there really is no one way to write. And I think in terms of, let's go to number three. Number three is, um, and we can start thinking about number four because that requires some thinking, I think. So number 3 is include a description of a habit of a crush or past loves, quotes, lines from movies they liked or whatever. And number 4, which we'll kind of tackle together, is paraphrasing a line from a favorite love song. And I thought of this in a slant way because uh, a poet I admire, Ray Antrobus, who's from England, and he once said, um, he was quoting one of the epigraphs in one of his books is a misquote. Um, so the actual quote is something something languishes in the body, but the way that he remembered it was what language is in the body. So instead of languishes, he recalled it uh, as language. And so I was interested in this kind of like not a rhyme per se, but kind of like the way we mishear. And especially when it comes to O'Hara's worldview, how things may not be what they appear and how we recollect things kind of differently, and kind of that room for imagination. And so I wanted to take a line from a favorite song, and we always mishear lyrics or misremember them. And so I think it would be interesting if we could kind of talk a little about uh uh a particular aspect of your person that you would like to mention, and a lyric that perhaps you may mishear, or you can't quite remember all the words, but you know the gist of it, and kind of put those things together. And of course, a love song can be a breakup song. My favorite is actually a breakup song. But So yeah, so let's take a few minutes to do that and think about that, and I guess Google if we need to. Okay. Um, so uh so another thing that I think two of the poets that I are extremely underrated, Essex Hemphill and Justin Chin, um uh is their ability to tackle these big ideas of America and what America represents and what it could be. And in a way that isn't kind of bitter, I guess that's the word that comes to mind. Like in a way that is very aspirational. And in a way that is honest in its critique of society, but there's also a degree of levity um and a level of acceptance, not in the sense of like this is how things should remain, but a level of kind of uh a projection of where we should be going, and a statement perhaps about what freedoms we should be able to enjoy and what work we have to do to continue to expand uh, the freedoms available to all peoples. And so, and they do this in a way that's very approachable. They do this in a way that isn't, I guess, preachy. I don't, that's the word I would use. It isn't preachy. It's very come as you are kind of, and this is what I'm about. And in my own poetics, I think that's a very important uh value of mine, which is kind of meeting people where they are, but not having them kind of turned off from the jump, and being kind of welcoming uh and uh having an honest conversation about where we are and where we should be going. Um and doing so through these poems that uh are very bold and very like I said, candid about where they are and what they're looking to do and kind of what they're about. And so I really appreciate that level of honesty and candor uh in some of these works. And in John Keane is interesting because also underrated. I think his work kind of uh backs up several of the points that we've talked about, which is the mishearing. So his poem Words on poets.org is about kind of meanings being amorphous. And one line I really like is, when you said feeling, did you mean fool? Love that. Uh and just this playful energy and kind of like happy vibes while we're talking about things that are very important and these heavy topics, but doing so with a light touch that is still very that still makes your point, but is kind of honest and maybe betrays some sort of vulnerability on the part of the speaker. Keen is also interesting. The two he has in Bomb magazine, uh where I'm going to be in Bomb magazine June or July. I think there's going to be an interview, so small plug. um uh but the two in Bomb is interesting because there is the one with the subway where he's on the train and stuff. And like there's a reference to all these streets in the city and these landmarks, which I thought was an interesting uh framing. I mean, he and O'Hara lived in a very different time, although they did both go to Harvard, but I think that's the extent, and they liked men, but I think that's the extent of their similarities, especially of that time period. And I think what's interesting is um the different ways that city life can be presented. um uh and in the other bomb poem, I think he references Hempel, which is interesting, um and is more a kind of straightforward narrative, I guess, of uh a snapshot of his life, but it's also grappling with kind of these uh money, and grappling with kind of what love is, and kind of the gender sexuality spectrum. Like there's a lot baked into like a short block of words. And it kind of spans like in Keen's book Punks, it spans like 30 years of poetry or writing or something. But within this poem, there is that span of kind of high school, and then like it kind of seemingly like all of his life all at once kind of thing. And that's a quality I really admire, and I think uh it's something that, if you're it's something to kind of try and see if you can accomplish if you want. So the next how are we on time? So the next let's see. uh I think these are very easy, like 5 through 8 we can do at once. uh Describe a time you were disappointed. Think of a writing trope like show not tell and defy it, reconceptualize it. Think about motifs you have used to ground your poem in time, space, locality. Um, and kind of number 8 is kind of like a shift in perspective. So if you haven't written this in yet or employed this yet, you can try it out, see how it works. And it can be the very like last couple lines, or like the last line, where you have this abrupt direct address, for example, or you have the last couple lines of some sort of um like you're reminiscing about something in a way that shifts the point of view or the perspective. So you turn it from a kind of more straightforward narrative, blah blah, I'm walking down Madison, whatever, to like this very almost like profound realization or some sort of epiphany, right, in the last couple of lines, that's like punchy and like kind of like a eureka moment, I guess. So let's try that, 5 through 8. And we'll come back, and then maybe we can, I don't know if folks want to share, I can talk some more, but we'll see what we want to do. Okay, so I guess I'll leave with, or I'll say a few things about revision. And back to the earlier point about tropes that I don't like. One of the tropes is you shouldn't mention pop culture because uh it should be, I mean, there's different bad rationales for this, but it has to be universal, or um it has to stand the test of time, or what, that's all BS. I think if pop culture is relevant to your lived experience in your life, why wouldn't you mention it? You know, and if folks need to Google something, then let them Google, if they want, right? And so that's number one. I also think there's a tendency I've noticed in reading submissions for Fence, um, that a lot of people overwrite. I think it's like there's a kind of like a younger poet I really admire who said that at NYU they were telling them to keep writing, and whatever's on the page, is on the page, which I think is terrible advice. I think you have to be very discerning about uh uh what you put on the page. I guess, like, don't be afraid to write less, I guess, is the point. Like, don't feel like you need to fill uh the white space. And I think in on the reading list, most of those poems are short. And maybe you can take a look, but part of the reason I assigned them is to make the point or the argument that uh you know shorter poems aren't necessarily lacking in the same heft or weight, right? um and the last point about revision is, a very easy trick that I think I teach people all the time is to look at the bottom of the page, or look at, the last few lines you wrote, and just cut them. um I think people feel very scared or whatever to do that, but probably, unless, it's a 3-line poem or whatever, but probably, the last couple of lines is fluff, right? Or your last thoughts, like you're kind of trailing off, or you're, distracted or bored or whatever by your own stuff. And, you know, chances are those lines aren't very good. Um, and so unless you feel very strongly that they should stay, or you can move them elsewhere. But an easy tip I always tell people is just cut, the handful of lines at the bottom. So I think that concludes our time. I mean, we have the reading later, but I'm done with my portion if other folks want to jump in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. That was amazing. Learned so much about all these different wonderful poets in conversation. Yes, that Essex Hemphill poem, American Wedding, has come up at 3 other open mouth workshops. I love seeing that it kind of continues to come up, that folks are still conversing with that piece. I'd recommend reading it if you haven't read it before. But it's amazing, yeah. And being based in Arkansas, and particularly around Fayetteville, we talk about Frank Stanford quite a lot. So thank you for bringing him into the conversation. But yeah, as Michael mentioned, there's going to be a reading tonight. So I'm just going to put the event right in there in the chat. 8 p.m. Central Time. Michael, as well as some folks who are also past contributors to the Arkansas International are going to be reading some of their work. Very excited. Also, Michael's second collection, Synthetic Jungle, is coming into the world. Definitely recommend checking that out. The cover is amazing. And yeah, we are excited that y'all spent your afternoon here with us. And yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.